Medalling in Deluising Bibuguesadlao. My name's Raymond Sewell, and I'm very happy to be here today with Margaret Robinson, Assistant Professor at DAL. Today's speech takes place on the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people, the Elnu, Skitchi Elnu, the ones who walk on the earth. And I'm very pleased to have this guest speaker in, and I hope you enjoyed the video. So Margaret, can you tell me a little bit about Adukwewinu, your story, and how it all began, and how you came to be in this position as an assistant professor?
Sure. Well, I grew up in poverty in Sheet Harbor. If you're not familiar with it, at the time I grew up there, it was about 2.5 hours drive outside of Halifax. And my parents had been involved in Native Council of Nova Scotia and in activism. And they had a 14-year fight with the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation over inadequate housing conditions. And so a lot of my childhood was taken up watching them fight with the government, watching them fight on the phone, watching them struggle to really provide a decent house for us to live in. And that experience really shaped me as a person, both experiencing what poverty was like firsthand, seeing that other people maybe live differently than we did. And so like you couldn't bring people home because they would notice we didn't have running water. And there was a lot of pressure to not talk about what goes on at home because the government might find out and take us away. So I became kind of an isolated person. And that combined with my bookwormish nature, I think drove me toward scholastic activities. So I really enjoyed school for the social interaction because that was most of my socializing was through classrooms. And so I think that experience kind of made me a person who liked school, even if I also saw that there were many bad things about school. Like it was also the place where sometimes horrible things happened and people were mean. And so that experience of seeing the classroom as an opportunity to really connect with the world was one of the formative experiences for me. And education gave me a way to get out of the house, to go to university. And so I remember when I first got to St. Mary's, I was so excited. I washed my hands constantly. I showered constantly because it was just this wonderful escape from poverty for me. And so I was really driven to make sure that I could get a job and take care of myself. And so I devoted myself to studies, even as I also devoted myself to seeing the world around me and trying to fix things where I could. I think once you've kind of grown up with that model of family members who are engaged in social issues, even if they're just issues that really affect you and your family specifically, that engagement, it's hard to drop that kind of social lens. And so I think I always looked at the world in terms of systems of oppression and was interested in understanding how they worked. So when I first started pursuing topics at school that were things I was interested in, I discovered I wanted to know more about how do people come to have views that lead them to do oppressive things. So I was interested in psychology, in religion, in issues of discrimination. And that has really shaped my work throughout my degree.
Yeah, you touched on points of where we come from. On reserve, we come from my reserve in particular. When Pegajawik, we had terrible water. It was only in recent memory that that's been corrected. But a lot of those are issues that Elnu people face, you know.
Well, sometimes it felt like living in the living in a novel. Like I remember in school, we would read the Laura Ingalls Wilder stuff about like the pioneer days. But you know, I would be melting snow in a pot in the stove to wash, so it seemed normal to me. But to it seemed like to everyone else, to all the middle-class white kids in class, it seemed like very strange and old-timey. But to me, it was like normal life. I guess it's similar for you?
Uh, for myself, growing up in Pabno, our water was really bad, so we couldn't drink it. So we had to drill our own well. And I found that when I moved to the city for the first time, I realized that there's expectations that the group outside of the reserve have for what's acceptable as a baseline, and
Mhm.
then there's where we live, where the stories are very different. So,
Yeah, there were all kinds of things that I only realized were not normal in retrospect once I got to go to other people's houses and see what they thought of was normal. Like our drinking water for the longest time, until I was like in junior high, uh, came from a spigot in a ditch by a friend's house. And I
mhm.
assume it came from some sort of spring up internal to the area, but there was no proof of that. But it's like everyone in our circle of friends got their drinking water from it. And
Mhm.
so it was only in retrospect I was like, gosh, what the heck was that? Like, was anyone checking that for E. coli or
Exactly, yeah.
high arsenic levels or anything? Similarly, we used to go swimming all the time in this lake near my house. And as an adult, I was talking with a woman about the problems posed by hydroelectric dams. And I said, oh,
Mhm.
I know what you're talking about. Yeah, I grew up on one of those floodplains. And she said, oh, well, then you probably grew up in a lake filled with mercury
Oh
from the
wow.
decomposing trees. And I was like, what? And I started Googling the physical impacts of mercury poisoning. And I was like, oh my dear, like all of these cognitive issues. And so
Mhm.
yeah, there were a lot of things that only seemed normal at the time because I didn't know other people live differently. But as an adult now, I look at it and think, wow, that seems very unsafe.
Yeah, of course. And you mentioned sitting and reading a lot. That was your window to the world, sort of, right? It was.
Oh, completely. I could get lost in it. I remember one time I was reading a Nancy Drew novel and my whole family left. They drove to the harbor.
Oh.
And I guess they must have talked to me and said, hey, we're going to the harbor. But I suddenly came to, I like came up out of the book and everyone was gone. And
Oh
I
wow.
was like, where the hell did everybody go? But I've noticed I still do that. I get zoned in on something and I don't pay attention to what's going on around me sometimes. My partner has to come in and say, hey, are you gonna eat food tonight or what are you doing? Uh, it's it's easy to develop that sort of hyper focus if you're prone that way. So yeah, I could lose myself in books and I still do with work. I notice sometimes I'll get in what I call the zone, and the next thing I know, it's 8 hours later, and I've been reading the whole time.
Do you find there's a creative element to your research, like, or your academic experience?
Oh yeah, I think what the part I find enjoyable is connecting what I'm reading and what other people are finding to my experiences, to the things I've seen, to the things I see other people experience.
Mm.
And making those kind of connections, I feel, is a creative process. And then also it's a creative process to see where the pieces that are existing fit, and then noticing what the gaps might be, and then
Mhm.
asking the questions about those gaps. Like if I notice that there's a relationship between um, poverty and experiences of being criminalized, then I
Mhm.
start to wonder, okay, so what is that relationship and how do these interact? And is it um, is it being mediated by some other thing? Or um, I now have the language to put that together, but as a younger person, I would just notice some things like, oh, why is it that I see these two things connected up? And I didn't necessarily have the terminology to describe what I was seeing or the problem I was noticing, but I think it's a very creative process to kind of weave those experiences and ideas together. So I'm not very interested in doing purely theoretical work. I like it to have a concrete application. And I think
Mhm.
that's partly because I do enjoy connecting it up with real experience. That if the theory doesn't make sense in terms of people's real lives,
Mhm.
it doesn't seem as useful to me.
And the criminalization of our people, that's a real thing. I noticed it's sort of like a public relations campaign from contact on, branding
Mhm.
us as other, different, angry, you know. Could you maybe comment on that, how they encode that story? Like,
Oh yeah, I mean, I have a pro-criminal bias, perhaps, because I grew up in a family that had a lot of criminals in it. My dad spent time in prison for armed robbery of a bank, sold drugs most of his life. So I noticed that when I started studying that as an adult, I I started wondering, okay, so why are certain things illegal? Like as a child, I wondered, why is cannabis illegal but alcohol is legal? And as an adult, when I started looking into that, it has a lot to do with who made the law. So if the people who made the law wanted to curtail the behaviors or criminalize the behaviors of certain people, you can do it by criminalizing things that they do. So, you know, if they prefer
wow.
Pepsi over Coke, let's make Pepsi illegal and then we can arrest them. Um, and it wasn't so much about the, the law and the legal system reflecting things that were good or bad for people sort of innately. There's all kinds of things that are very big public health problems, but we don't make them illegal. Like, you know, smoking has not been illegal, and we knew it was giving people cancer and killing them for years and years, and we didn't make it illegal. And so looking at that legal system and realizing the legal system, yes, part of it is about trying to protect people generally, but a big part of it is also about dominating people and about
Mm,
creating systems in which you can control and criminalize other people in order to keep a hold on, say, stolen land or
mm,
uh, political power. And so seeing some of that play out in the daily news, it's always very stressful. But it helps me to say, okay, well, this isn't about criminals, bad guys and good guys. This is about people dominating each other or fights for power. And
mm,
so I think it helps me avoid getting distracted by arguments that I know are actually spurious. Like,
mm.
you know, people will say, "Oh, well, no, it's about conserving the fishery," for instance, the issue with Mi'kmaq boats. I'm like, well, we conserved the fishery for almost 13,000 years.
Wow.
Um, I think that's a pretty good track record. Let's take a look at the settler track record in conservation. Nowhere near as good. No, I mean, it's not all shiny and rosy on our end. I feel like we did a very bad thing by participating in the settler-focused hunting and trapping industry. When that
Mm,
shifted from being about us and our relationship with the animals to being like a commercial activity for hats
mm.
in Europe, I feel like that was a bad mistake. But you know, that doesn't erase 13,000 years of conservation and animal knowledge.
Yeah.
So I feel like when people say, you know, oh, it's about the conservation, I'm like, that's a distractive issue. The bigger issue is colonialism. And
Mhm.
uh, it's ironic to constantly see how colonial governments will separate people who actually could be allies. Like, I think when I look at, I know fishers, I know settler fishers, and when I look at the issues they have, most of their problems stem from the interactions with the government and the government trying to control and curtail their lives. So they actually have more in common with Mi'kmaq fishers than they do with the federal government and the Department of Fisheries. So I think I felt like the situation was similar with Oka, where I thought, okay, well, the French in Quebec are a language oppressed minority compared to the English majority. And so we could be bonding with them about language rights in Canada, but we didn't. Instead, the federal government exacerbated tensions between French police and Indigenous people in Mohawk territory and benefited from that enormously. And so I think there are ways where the colonial lens helps clarify issues that otherwise might be very muddy.
Wow.
I think it's amazing to look and see at how well colonial systems work, even if people think that they're doing something different.
Mhm.
I never really appreciated the distinction between the systems of oppression and individual attitudes before. I used to think if we got rid of all the prejudiced people, if we got rid of all
Mm-hmm.
the stereotypes, if
Yeah,
it
yeah.
was just people who wanted to do good things, everything would work fine. And it's not that case at all. The systems are in themselves designed to view us and frame us in particular disempowering ways. And until you change those systems so that it doesn't matter if you have a nice person or a mean person in charge of them, the system will continue to function as it does. Like, so
Mm.
it shifted my focus from trying to understand how individuals think and behave to trying to understand how systems behave. So most of my undergrad work, I had done an undergraduate in English, focusing on creative writing, because that was my,
Nice. Yeah,
my
yeah.
jam. Uh, I was a little disappointed. I felt like when I took English at the time, it was very, it was just sexist. There
Yeah.
wasn't really any kind of feminist analysis. They didn't have any understanding of culture apart from their own. It was very ethnocentric,
Mm-hmm.
focused mostly on European men. And I mean, some of it was great. I thought Marlowe was an amazing, funny writer, but hardly anyone read him anymore. But I just wasn't a fan of some of the big canon names. They
Mm.
didn't seem like they were speaking to me or my experience. And my other major was religious studies. And so I got into that in a big way and pursued that for my master's and my PhD, looking at how people develop systems and processes that frame people in othering ways. So looking at how did early Christianity become anti-Semitic? How
Mm.
did how did later Christianity become homophobic? And looking at what those functions, what function those kind of attitudes serve for the group. And as a scholar, I think I've expanded that now to understand how systems function, even if the people in those systems don't necessarily agree explicitly with the system aims. And that's a little more frustrating because
Mm.
I mean, you must experience that as a university member. I know I do.
Mm.
So we're part of a system, and we might do particular things in the class that we think are better for students, but it's not going to change how the university functions as a whole when we have an awesome class that does new methods in pedagogy or that engages indigenous philosophy or indigenous ways of knowing. It doesn't change anything outside of our classroom. The system continues to operate despite individual good work. And so it's thinking about how do you actually start to change a system. That's a big
You think,
challenge.
do you think it's because the systems aren't democratic? Like the committee structures and the hierarchy? Um,
Yeah. So I was involved one time in a process where we were hiring someone for a pretty powerful position. And I noticed that all of the assumptions we made about how we go about doing it
mm.
helped decide what kind of candidates you got. And so that made me more aware of the ways in which the assumptions we go into a situation with can shape what we think are possible outcomes in ways we didn't expect. So we go in saying, you know, we want a rule breaker, we want someone who thinks outside the
Yeah,
box,
yeah,
but they have to have 20 years of experience
yeah,
and you know, a real clear track record of
yeah.
accomplishments. And so you know, rule breakers don't win awards all the time.
No.
uh, so, you know, there can be ways in which the criteria we set for particular roles or particular positions of power make it implicitly already decide that job is going to some particular type of person.
Right.
Uh, so yeah, so it got me thinking about credentialism. So
Mm.
one of the problems I think Indigenous people face is that a lot of our knowledge does not get acknowledged by bigger systems like universities
Yeah.
because they don't have a way to measure and specify it the way that they do with degrees. So, you know, degrees are ways of acknowledging particular achievements within the education system.
Mm-hmm.
And unless there are acknowledgements of equivalencies for that level of experience and knowledge in, say, Indigenous community fields, the university has no way of acknowledging that kind of experience or that kind of expertise.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, how do you create a equivalency for, say, the role of an Indigenous elder who's been working with youth in their community for
Yeah.
40 years. Like,
Hmm.
is that a PhD? Is that
Yeah.
a professor emeritus? We don't know what to call that in terms of equivalency, and we certainly don't compensate them equivalently.
Hmm.
So, like, the ability to translate across those systems, it's really not there at all.
That's true, yeah. And I think of my experience with committees, with the university, without the university. I'm on a lot of committees. I noticed a lot of times I don't see a lot of democracy, so I don't see a lot of people at the table because they say if the committee's too large, it can't function, you know. But coming from where I'm from, we have talking circles, and the chiefs, the natural chiefs at least, aren't above the grandmothers, and nobody's above anybody. And we talk about issues and all bring our piece of truth to the circle, right? But in the Delta model, I noticed you get a few experts on a committee that write a policy, for example, and then when the policy's breached or something, they say, "Well, that wasn't us. That's the policy. That's that document. That's alive. That's who you blame, not the 12 people that you know." You know what I mean? And
Yeah,
I find that strange coming from where I'm from. It's like that's the colonial mechanism, right? It shifts the energy off of who's in power and sort of diverts it, you know, to shift and
yeah.
blame in a way. Because I know in the talking circle, we're all facing each other and you're accountable, right? So the
Mhm.
Delta model, it feels like there's a lot of protection from criticism because you can refer to the policy instead of just things I'm noticing coming from my worldview and then being put in academia. You must notice that a lot of things you understand in theory, you might have read in your studies, but you don't understand Western thought in practice. So, any comments about that, or?
Yeah, I noticed this. So the issue of the idea that we couldn't possibly have uh, more than 10 people in a committee before it becomes completely non-functional. I think it it comes from a cultural perspective that hasn't put much effort into working in a large group like that. They
Right.
don't know what the techniques would be. And so I think we happen to have really good techniques for working with large groups and coming to consensus decision making.
Hmm.
I think we happen to have a lot of people in our culture who are good at um, summarizing different perspectives and synthesizing those. So, like, I see this in my own life where I'll be in a meeting where people are arguing, and I notice, well, they disagree about this one thing, and that's what they're arguing about, but they actually agree about this one bigger thing, but they're never going to talk about that for some reason. So I find I tend to spend a lot of meeting time summarizing and synthesizing what other people have said. So, I hear so and so is concerned about this, and so is concerned about that. So I notice there's a mutual concern with this issue. Could we agree on this, and then maybe
Yeah.
come up with a plan about dealing with these specifics? So I think in some ways maybe that's like I tend to see that as my role in community as a two-spirit person, is to
Hmm.
mediate disagreement. But I think some of that just comes from having been part of like a large family where sometimes lots of people had to be involved in decision making, or decisions had to be made over a longer period of time.
Mm.
I think there's can be a tendency in settler culture to focus on timelines and deadlines
Yeah.
and to give them a life of their own as if they're a person who will die if they're not met,
Yeah.
if
Yeah.
their needs are not met on schedule. And so I think there's this idea maybe that somehow we just don't make decisions or we never really get
Mm.
around to closure, and that's not true. Um, and so I think we maybe make uh, solid decisions. I don't know if I'd want to call it democracy all the time.
Mm.
I think democracy brings up a lot of questions about who counts as a voter. It can
Okay.
sometimes overlook things that I think our cultures tend to not overlook. Like I notice sometimes democracy can turn into a popularity contest or mob rule
True.
and
True.
ignore those on the margins. Like, you know, most of us are all okay, so those people don't matter. Whereas I
Mm.
think our Mi'kmaq approaches think about those people on the margins more carefully and include them in the discussion and prioritize concerns about elders and youth in a way that democracy as a topic doesn't necessarily do. Like we don't even let younger people vote in
Mm-hmm.
democracy in Canada.
Yeah, yeah, I know.
Like they can go to war, they can't vote on it. Yeah, so I feel like we have a lot of cultural practices that I think are better in a lot of
Mm-hmm.
ways. And so those skills about being in, especially in settler meetings, it can be handy. It's like a hidden tool belt. At the same time, I've been in particularly federal government organized meetings where we're there as Indigenous people to give advice about research projects, usually projects that have already been happening for several years without our input, that were
Yeah.
designed without our input. And they're
And they
like,
want a cosign at the end.
yeah, they just want to like a rubber
Yeah.
stamp that it's all
Yeah.
okay. And they want to be able to say they consulted with the committee.
Mm-hmm.
And you give them negative feedback and they're completely nonplussed and they don't respond to it or accept it. So like I was in a meeting one time where people were talking about Indigenous health issues and they referred to the obesity epidemic. And I said, well, I'm not really sure we all agree on what that would mean.
Mm-hmm.
Indigenous people have different body standards. We
Mm-hmm.
have different approaches to body size.
Mm-hmm.
And this is really, I would really prefer to see a focus on nutrition, access to traditional foods,
Yeah.
a reduction of settler-based processed foods,
Mm-hmm.
and let's look at how much money people have to spend in order to eat healthy, and
Accessibility. Yeah.
focus less on body size, which seemed to me kind of a superficial approach. Like it
Mm-hmm.
wasn't really health-based.
Mm-hmm.
And they were not keen on that at all. They
Wow.
felt like they told me I was being insulting to people who worked in that industry of
Mm.
obesity science. And I was like, well, I'm not sure how to tell you what I know without you taking it as an insult. So
Yeah.
it's not always it's not always a happy experience to work with systems and try to offer the benefit of our knowledge.
What we talked about was I'm picking up on methodologies. I think it was Noam Chomsky said you don't go on vacation and see the place from the plane and then claim it. You know, that's sort of how contact was. We were all here. We had great methodologies for tens of thousands of years at least, well developed. One thing I point to is like a snowshoe, for example. It's seen in Western, or at least it was, as primitive, but it's the
Mhm.
apex technology. It returns to the land. It's very green, you know, and it's all how you look at things. So one thing I often think about is I want to let settlers and different people know is that we weren't sitting on the beach waiting to be discovered. We had methodologies, we had trade systems, we had language, you know,
Mm.
nomenclature for all the land. I think there's a misconception. Like someone will say, here, I have this new hot book and it's about indigenous methodologies. They're finally figuring it out, sort of. But no, hey, we had this for a long time. It just hasn't been accepted by the structure, you know. So any comments
Yeah.
on sort of our methodologies and things like this?
Well, I think the focus in settler culture on text
Mm-hmm.
and on um, promotion and marketing, like settlers are great at promoting and marketing their concepts. Like, you know, if you can get the right language for it and you can get it down on a poster or in a book, then that's official and it's spectacular. Whereas they denigrate things that are verbal, things that aren't preserved in the text. The text is
Mm-hmm.
very central to Western culture. And that has not been the case. I mean, you know, even Mi'kmaq, who had a text, it was not central in our culture.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we need to avoid judging our cultures by the standards that Western folks set, because that's a rigged system. That's a rigged game.
Mm.
We already know who the winner's going to be in that competition.
Like a
If you
circus
judge
game.
it, yeah, if you judge it by settler standards, the settler culture wins. So I've had to work through my own internalized expectations that Indigenous culture will be in some way ineffective or primitive, because I grew up with all those same books that settlers read going to
Mm-hmm.
school that suggest that we just didn't have it together, and that our culture
Mm.
didn't really contribute anything important. And finding out that was a lie, and finding out that actually there's lots of stuff in my culture that I think is amazingly good and that I wish other people would adopt, that changed everything.
Mm.
Yeah, if you don't start off with loving yourself and loving your people and loving where you come from, you're just going to be spending your whole life trying to pretend to be somebody else. And that is not a good approach. I think to a certain degree, to participate in some of the academic institutions we have, there's a certain element of whiteface that has to go on.
Mm.
To be successful in academia,
Mm.
you do have to practice academic culture. And for the most part, that is a white Western culture.
Mm.
And lots of us are very good at doing that.
Mm-hmm.
But that isn't who we are as people. And there are other ways to do academia that aren't predicated on Western ways of being. And I think Indigenous people are great at developing our own theories and approaches. And so rather than asking myself, did the design of the wigwam, why wasn't it permanent? Why didn't we make permanent settlements? Instead, starting from the question of what benefits might there be to having a movable house structure?
Mm-hmm.
Why would people choose to do that? And then looking at it from that positive framework, and to say, okay, let's assume everything had a good reason. What might it be? And
Mm-hmm.
then bringing that lens to it. It changed the way that I viewed my own culture. When I would encounter issues, topics people would discuss, a particular Mi'kmaq tradition, occasionally there are things in that where I'm like, yeah, I am not on board with that. Why would we do that? That seems weird.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, thinking about, okay, well, why might someone do that? What might be the benefit in that? And even if I can say, okay, I see the benefit, that might not be how I want to pursue that benefit, but maybe there are other Indigenous approaches to getting the same benefit, so that I'm at least pursuing the similar ends to things my ancestors did, even if I'm not doing it in the same way. So maybe there were particular environmental considerations into wigwam construction. And maybe the house I live in is never going to meet those specific criteria. I can't pick it up and move it somewhere to accommodate animal needs for this region in different times of the year. Are there other things that I could do to secure the environment and protect it in ways that would matter? Yes, there are. Let's focus on that. And so I think trying to, starting from a assumption that people knew what they were doing and had good reasons for it, it helps us see what they were. It helps us embrace our culture and love it in ways that help us be happier people. I don't know, maybe you found something similar in your own connection with culture.
Yeah. I found I grew up traditional in Winnipeg, and I found when I went out, I studied all the same things. I studied the Thomas More's Utopia, all their classic literature, Adam Smith, and when I got to the city, I knew it in theory, but I always knew what being Elnu was, And I think that you're right. The written word has been really oppressive. Academic English has been very oppressive because if you think of tense and you think of these concepts of time, even we don't express ourselves like that in the language. So the way that we're expressing ourselves, if it doesn't fit in academic English, we'll get bad grades or that, and they'll think that this person doesn't know anything, but maybe it's that formula that doesn't allow our worldview to come through and these bright ideas. And to touch on that topic is I did my own 10 years. I finished my master's in Atlantic Canadian Studies, and I realized at the end there was a PR campaign to really put down our culture and make it seemed like it was insignificant. Like you were saying, it's all in the literature, like, and even the structure of academic English and the violence that's inherent in English. Um, Once I was done, and once I started doing my own research and thinking about data sovereignty and thinking about technologies, and like I said, the green technologies and that viewpoint, once I shifted out of what I had learned from those fundamentals, those fundamental books about our culture being, savage or other, I started reading Bell Hooks, Stuart Hall, Noam Chomsky, all the classics, and started building up my own posture again. And looking back, it's like all the culture just kind of like, I guess maybe like an analogy would be like a magic eye. You see all this, and then it really pops out. And one day I was like, whoa, the grandmothers are everything. Our teachings are everything. There's so much sacredness in our knowledge and our data keeping and who we allow privy to the data. And I don't know, that's just like off the cuff how I feel about it. I feel like for us to be more included in the academy, there has to be room for our methodologies and held at equal. Essentially, that's.
Yeah, that popping experience where the
Yeah.
picture suddenly becomes clear. I had that too. I was reading a bunch of collections of Mi'kmaq stories that had been collected by Rand, who was a missionary, settler missionary from the time period. And so, of course, it's all filtered through this sort of Rand lens. And so it's not exactly the way someone in our community would have told the story, just all on their own to other people in the group. But even then, reading those stories and seeing the values communicated in the story and seeing that connection to those values in my own family life and the practices that I didn't think of as Indigenous, I just thought, oh, that's kind of a weird thing we do. I don't see other people doing that. Suddenly seeing that and realizing, oh, what I'm seeing here is Indigenous culture. That made a huge difference for me in understanding my family and understanding colonialism and realizing that, so our family was pretty assimilated. Like my grandmother had her language stripped away from her through day school. My family members didn't grow up speaking Mi'kmaq and didn't want people to pursue speaking Mi'kmaq. They actively discouraged it, encouraged us to pass as white. But even then, I would see things that we did in our family and ways that we did things that were not settler ways. And so even seeing my family as the object of colonial systems that intended to strip their culture from them, that separated them from their community and their community members and their ways of looking at the world. And then seeing that internalized within themselves and seeing them actively try to strip their culture away as a defense mechanism, as a way to survive, to see that it still continued on in ways that could be recognizable, that just blew my mind. It was so impressive. It was so impressive to see the way that the culture could stay present, even with all of those things working against it. It changed the way that I saw indigeneity, which is always framed as a weakness, but is actually incredibly strong. Like, if the powers of a colonial government for 500 years tried to eliminate anything else, they would have a good job at being successful. They've got all the money and all the power and all the staffing they need, but they haven't been successful in eliminating indigeneity, Indigenous culture, Indigenous ways of thinking, being, and knowing. And I find that so impressive.
That's really profound, yeah. I think of even the crude binaries that I notice, status, non-status, male, female. These things for me, they didn't exist pre-contact. It was more of fluidity to it. And when I think of I guess I want to talk about binaries because I was reading an article where the Church of America, some church in America said there was no gay marriage in all of America. And then I think, well, that's quite the statement to make when this was totally normal for so many millennia before the arrival of another ethos, right? I think of the binary is good and bad, and I think about our elders tell us stories. People are good and bad. People are our community status, non-status. There's no this or that. I find in academia there's a lot of dark and light, this, that, and that's very othering. And one thing, I'm two-spirit as well, so I think about gender sort of as poles,
Mhm.
maybe masculine, feminine, and different days I'm different things. So one day I may be more feminine, and then you can just feel cool about it, and you don't have to worry. I find that the Western structures just compartmentalize, synthesize everything
Mhm.
in your identity, and that becomes very, very. For me, it was damaging when I grow up thinking about the comments people make about different people, and I think about the fragmentation that colonial mechanisms want to have. They want to have everyone compartmentalized in their own space and not collaborating against the system. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that, because this is something I'm unpacking in real time as an Indigenous academic, getting out of this indoctrination that it's this or that, or everything seems so finite. And with Indigenous, like you're saying, it's just so open and so free, you know?
Yeah, I same experience. So I noticed Western culture is very focused on compartmentalization. So the idea, for me, it coalesces in structuralism.
Mm,
That Western culture loves understanding how the pieces come together and make up something different, and what else you could do with the pieces. They're interested in breaking
mm,
things into their components. It's like
wow.
that kid who takes apart everything it gets its hands on and just plays with the pieces. Um, there's a focus on understanding things in their units. And
Mm,
sometimes that it gets expressed in kind of horrific ways. Like, I don't think our community would have ever come up with the idea of vivisection, which is
mm,
taking a living creature apart while it's still alive.
yeah.
I don't think that's something our people would even think to do. Uh, but the focus on categories has a tendency to try to break things into units and to keep those units separate,
Mm,
um, and name those units, label each little individual piece. And I don't feel like that's an Indigenous approach to knowledge. Indigenous picture tends to go big picture and see what
mm,
are the relations between different ways of doing things or different ways of being. What kind of stuff can different ways of being bring to the picture? And so I think two-spirit people tend to not get labeled in Indigenous culture the same way they do in settler
mm,
culture. Like, settler culture wants to say, well, a lesbian is very different from a gay man, who's very different from a bisexual, who's very different
mm,
from a trans person, who's very different from a non-binary person. Like, they all of that categorization. Now, sometimes that can be helpful for people to figure out distinctions in their own mind about who they are and who they aren't in that given
mhm,
moment. But I think it misses the way that we can change over time, the way we can change from day to day.
mhm,
That fluidity piece, I feel,
mhm,
gets lost. And the idea that you're somehow an individual with all of these identities all by yourself doesn't really reflect the way I experience identity, which is often interpersonal. It's not
mhm,
just a question of who am I all by myself, it's who am I with this person? Who am I with this group? Who am I when I relate with my family? And how does that relationship shape who we are together? You think about all the important people in your life who've been fundamental in helping you grow into the person you are. Like,
mm,
identity doesn't seem to me to be separate from interrelation. And so, like, I remember when I first started doing stuff in queer community and people found out I was Indigenous, they would say, oh, well, do you have, what's the Indigenous word for gay? I'm like,
mhm.
okay, well, first off, there's no Indigenous word for anything. There are specific languages from
Yeah,
specific
yeah, yeah.
nations. But and then when I would explain, oh, well, we don't necessarily have a word for gay, uh, they would look at me like, oh, well, that's kind of backward and undeveloped. Like, what, you don't have a word for gay? Um, because if we don't label people by specific things they do that way, um, I think the approach to sexuality is much more fluid and free, that it doesn't come with a bunch of social repercussions the way that it can in settler culture. So like I remember people asking me about, so, you know, when you came out to your family, was there a lot of homophobia? And I think, well, yeah, there was, but it wasn't cultural related. It was stuff they picked up because of what generation they were part of. They were baby boomers, and they looked at everything through the lens of like, how is this going to make your life difficult? And so they were seeing me make a decision they thought that was going to make my life difficult, and they weren't
Wow.
very keen on it.
Yeah, yeah.
But when I came out to my grandmother, she didn't have a problem with it at all. And at first I thought maybe she didn't understand what I was saying. And then she told me a very long story that made it clear that, yeah, she does get it. And it's not all about me. Yeah, I think I've come to really enjoy the awareness that Indigenous cultural frameworks for sexuality and gender are nation specific, and that they're very different from a settler framework that asks not first and foremost, you know, tell me about you and how you experience yourself and your body or anything like that, but instead says, what's the gender of the person you're attracted to? I feel like there's something strange with a self-labeling process that starts by looking at other people and trying to label them first.
Yeah.
Like you see it all the time in surveys. So I work in gender and sexuality and health research. And so we'll ask people, you know, what genders are you attracted to? It's like, okay, so which box do they check if they don't know what gender somebody was? There's usually no box for that. What do you check if it changes over time? So I notice the category tends to expect that the healthy person will have a very clear, focused identity and that it never changes. You just figure out what it is and it's permanent. And I find that that's not always the way I experience or understand my own gender and sexuality. That, you know, sometimes it's masculine, sometimes it's feminine, sometimes it's a bit of both. It resembles a lot more of what settlers talk about when they talk about queer theory, that seeing all of the difference in the box that's supposed to be all the same.
Yeah. It's a great discussion because I think about this. I see time as a social construct and borders, and I feel like I'm always running away from a grid. Like colonialism wants to put a grid on me and just like, that's it, you're this, and we can totally understand you. And then I think of the community I'm from, where it's about community first, like you said, and they focus on the individual. Like the elders tell me, from here, my elders say, if someone stole in the past, they weren't criminalized. We did that. We made them so desperate. We failed them as a community. So I like to talk about community and what I call the circle or community brain, and then talk about the hyper focus on the individual and gritting. And like you were saying, like, imagine being committed to being one thing your whole life when, you know, every day is different. You know, there is such a beauty in the fluidity of that. You know, that's the poetic part of life. We're always changing, you know, and it's very exciting. And like you were saying, that encoding of normalcy, not in our system, in our normative system, but in theirs, of having a clear concept of exactly what you are, and it doesn't change. And it's very, I think that's very damaging. So I think it's good medicine for us to be talking about this, and letting people know that there's another way of life, sort of, you know.
I've tried to be suspicious of where people try to slip hierarchies into any discussion of change. So there's a tendency in Western culture to see that if something changed, it got better. So, you know, maybe so as a bisexual person, I would often hear people say, oh yeah, you know, I knew someone who identified as bisexual, but then they figured themselves out and they came out as a lesbian. And that'll happen to you too. And sometimes they were saying it to be like encouraging. I think they were like, you know, stick in there, you'll become a legitimate person soon. But I think there's this assumption that if something changes from one thing into another thing, that second thing has to be a better, more improved version, or there's something wrong. And they can't just see change as equivalent, that one thing is just as good as another thing, it's just different. That a stage doesn't have to be assessed on a hierarchy all the time. That there's not, it's not better to be an elder than it is to be a baby. It's a different thing. And so I think we have a tendency in Western culture to think we have to figure out any change, was it good or bad? Whereas in indigenous cultures, change happens all the time. Change is constant and expected. It can be cyclical. It doesn't have to have a moral value attached to it. If somebody shifts their identity label or changes their name, it's interesting. It's like, oh, that sounds like there's a story there. What went on? Tell me about it. I'd love to hear what happened. But I don't have to like pick it apart and try to decide, is it good or bad? Is this an improvement over the previous identity? Or, how did you make the mistake of previously identifying that wrong way?
Yeah.
It change. That's okay.
You think it's social Darwinism at play, or consumerism even, or wanting to augment every time? Like, well, I guess it's reflective of hierarchy stepping up. Like, if you have nowhere to step up in the circle, you're comfortable. Like, I think
Yeah.
about name changes. Like, I'm on my second round of naming. Bibugwes was my first name from the elders, which is Sparrowhawk. And I was that for years. And then I went through a second ceremony. Now I'm Ladlau, which is like the bull, El Toro, sort of, reflected of the work I'm doing with Mi'kmaq rights and Elnu rights. Is all I think about, right? So, but I lose that other name. Like, I still carry it with me. But you're right. It's equal. It's not like I'm better now all of a sudden, like a Pokemon.
Yeah, we're not Pokemon.
yeah, you know what I mean?
Charizard is so much more impressive
yeah.
than Charmander.
Yeah. But it's so true that you're not always, like, in our community, there's no need to go up to another level. The elders teach us that the elders and children's, they're all part of the circle, and they share that top, the elder, and Mi'kmaq, the children, and they're equal in the circle. So when we were young, if my dad wanted to move to Amherst, for example, he asked the family, we said no, and that we had an equal part in it. And in the Western world, kids have no say, so it's very, very different. I love that. For me, that's like a eureka moment, that there is that idea in Western that you go up to something else, that we don't have that concept really. Even a natural chief, they talk to the grandmothers. The grandmothers are probably that highest council, but they're so humble and part of the circle. So it's really quite interesting. I don't know if it's social Darwinism in the West, or if it's commodity culture, looking for like the newest iPhone every year, or I'm not sure.
I think they work together for sure. Like the myth of progress, that things always have to be better.
Yeah.
And you even see it in academia among the most supportive and liberal-minded people who have at their root, they believe things should always be developing and progressing.
Yeah.
And the language, sometimes it's hard to find language to talk about what you're going to do in a research project that doesn't take up this progress talk, that things are always going to be getting better, and we're going to develop a new way to do this or a better way to do that. Sometimes, like, there doesn't seem to be room in Western research for let's just see what happens. Let's find a way to do this in a way that's going to include more people. Or like you always have to use some kind of hierarchical language that suggests we're moving up, 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 up. And I see that with, plans for how to use land, how to use territory. There's always this expectation that, well, you've got to be milking every ounce of resource and profit out of it, or somehow you're a bad person. And that's not coming from our culture. That's coming from very specific historical developments in Christianity, really. And so as a person with theological training, I look at that and like, so I know you're not intending to be a theocracy, but this is what you're doing. You're taking up these very culturally and historically specific views about moral goodness and attaching it to particular acts, and you're building environmental policy on that, business
Mm.
policy. And it's always this expectation we have to constantly be producing and making more and making it better. And I don't think that that's, it makes me wonder, how are we supposed to fit Indigenous research methods into this system when it's really not going to fit very well at all, because it has very different aims.
So it's like that the Christian ethos of Father, Son, Holy Spirit, and all male, and the world belongs to males to use as they'd like. So it really looks at the patriarch too. And as decolonization, I think it's our responsibility to kind of work away at the patriarch as well, because um, that theology is at the brain of it. You think of hierarchy, eh? You think that
Yeah,
ethos is that spirit's in there, like.
and I think it puts, in terms of how it comes to Indigenous communities through colonialism, it puts very different pressures and expectations on us depending on what gender they perceive us to be.
Yeah.
So I see Indigenous men have been heaped on with these expectations about mimicking colonial masculinity, and
Mm.
that is not a very successful set of expectations. It doesn't really fit who we are as a culture. And trying to meet those expectations has caused all kinds of cultural problems, all kinds of horizontal violence.
Mm.
Uh, and I see it in my own family when men are trying to figure out how do you express yourself as a man and feel comfortable with who you are as a man if the person who is making a lot of decisions for the
Mm.
family is a woman.
Mm.
Or how to maneuver that. Like in my family, my grandmother was sort of the center of the family. But if
Mm.
you move outside of that even a little bit, suddenly you're in a whole different world. And
Mm.
so I remember going to people's houses as a kid sometimes and wondering, like, why is your dad telling your mom what to do all the time?
Mm.
Uh, but what I was seeing was patriarchy. I just didn't know
Mm.
what it was called yet. And so I think those expectations, like you see them in residential schools where they have this set of gender and economic expectations for men around
Mm.
farming and being the breadwinner. For a lot of Indigenous men, for being forced to farm was practically being forced to have a sex change. Like if you come
Mm.
from a community where men didn't farm, that's not going to seem like a masculine activity to you.
Mm.
But if the if the people in charge are now telling you their white god insists you
Yeah.
be a farmer, that must have been a total just mind in a blender experience.
Yeah, it is disheartening to think about how much the patriarchy has affected our social and family units. I know I grew up traditional. It's my mom, my aunties. If I had an opinion, I got the slipper, so I was always I listened, and you see that you go to your friend's house and the way they talk to their mom and the way, their dad has final say and everything's ready. That's a really a different, it's really ingrained in Western society that the male's in charge of the house. Where I'm from, females are the leaders. To me, it's a matriarch, um, and we consult the grandmothers on everything. So it's a real shock if you're doing the two-eyed seeing thing and you're coming from our communities to the other world. There's kind of that, I don't, would it be a bias or something that men rule everything? Like it seems like that seems like their baseline, and then so decolonization, I think we got to wear away at that, bring back the feminine and the women as leaders, because I don't think they like the posture of Indigenous women being leaders. I think that's a threat to colonialism.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at historically, one of the first things they did was refuse to interact with women or to take them seriously as negotiators.
Mm.
Uh, and I'm sure, coming from their perspective, it must have seemed very strange to be expected to negotiate with women. Like, it must have seemed like being asked to negotiate with children or something. But
Mm.
uh, like the story you describe of being a child and getting to have a say in whether the family moved or not,
Mm-hmm.
I had the same experience in my family, and
Mm-hmm.
we got asked. We got to have an equal say in the discussion and in the decision. And I think that experience of being included, a feeling like your opinion mattered,
Mm-hmm.
um, it doesn't raise selfish people. It raises people who think about others and how decisions might impact other people. If you got included, you include. You learn how to
Yeah.
include. I think we've got amazing cultures and we've got great practices, and I think they can apply in all kinds of areas. I love figuring out how can we apply these practices in education. I think if all education systems adopted Indigenous practices, they'd be way better, not just for Indigenous people, but for everybody.
Yeah.
And maybe I'm a cultural supremacist after all.
Yeah. That's awesome. Well, I'm mindful of your time, so I think this discussion, I'm a religious studies minor at heart, and I think that we really connected on that level because we've been studying things, and it's good to know that I'm not on my own, you're not on your own.
Oh yeah.
Our experiences are very similar, and it's very encouraging. And I think students and even faculty, if they watch this, will see that we're not alone. A lot of times when we move out of here, we move to like Jabuktuk or Halifax, and we feel like we left the reserve of that. But this is all Mi'kma'ki, this is just occupied Mi'kma'ki, and when we're in occupied Mi'kma'ki, it's very different. We're not the ones in charge, so we're navigating that all the time. And sometimes you feel like the only one in your dorm room with all these problems. You're hesitant to really share your culture in that because you don't know the implications in such a system. So you go home every weekend. I love it, being home. I always went home, and I think this discussion really brings people into that sense of community that as Indigenous intellectuals, Indigenous academics, we got to keep pressing our agenda, and we have to really be proud of where we come from, and we have to be proud of the work we're doing, because we're whittling away at these structures that they, like you said, they didn't in 500 years with all the resources, they didn't suppress our posture. So I thank you again.
Thanks for having me. I'd love to just chat with you again and again.
Yeah, we will. In touch. Yeah.
Miigwech.
Miigwech. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Walalan. Take care.
Walalan.